Hi everyone, I'm Josh, and happy Christmas if you're watching this the day it comes out. Today, I want to talk about the highlights of 2024, or perhaps some surprises for the year. And this really is just a all-encompassing video to discuss all the books that weren't quite good enough to be on my best of list this year. And I wanted to save those for after Christmas holiday, since I don't know how many people actually watching videos on Christmas Day. You'll be with your family. But these are all books that were on my mind this year, things that I felt like I wanted to talk about or share with you and encourage you to read for various reasons, even if they weren't quite the best of the best for me this year. And with that said, there's not much of an order here in what I'm discussing. Maybe there's a slight bias towards the books I had more excited about towards the front end of this video, just because I want to make sure I'm enthusiastic getting into this. Okay, let us begin with what is truly probably the biggest surprise of the year, and that is The Dead Take the A Train by Cassandra Khaw and Richard Kadrey. And this is a urban fantasy horror book that is really, in my mind, something that just feels so much like we're in the Buffy or Angel universe, where there's these sort of morally gray characters who formed a friend group. They're fighting these evil entities, these evil corporations, and add in some Lovecraftian horror. And for me, I'll start by saying this was my first book by Cassandra Khaw, and I had heard mixed things about them, and I wasn't sure what to expect. And while I'm not saying this is my favorite of the year, mostly because it's kind of campy and it's just not quite what I'm looking for in horror, but for the vibes were perfectly embodying what I wanted in this moment, or at least something that I could really enjoy. Oftentimes, I love watching something like Buffy, but I find that when I get to fiction, there's something about it that I have a hard time really getting invested in. Those sort of campy, almost YA vibes of urban fantasy horror. There was just something here that just perfectly resonated with me, that made these vibes that I felt like associated with Buffy, or more specifically, honestly, the more mature adult version of Angel, that just made me fall in love with this book. I want to really just communicate clearly how much I love this. I think I did talk about it pretty effectively in my media freakout tag, but in terms of like what I think about as sort of a highlight of the year, this is one of them. I'm just so excited to continue this series, and I'm really excited to read more about Cassandra Khaw. A great, I think, start to the list. Next up, let's pivot to a classic, Frank Kafka's The Trial, with its Kafkaesque absurdist world of this man who is put on trial for doing a crime that is ambiguous and unaddressed, not really being explained, with proceedings that are never ending and never concrete, never really on his side. It's always a sort of corporate or authoritarian system that is just constantly pushing him down, constantly demoralizing him, taking away any hope that he has, and possibly overcoming this absurd charge that has no basis, that has no founding. And what I loved about this really was just its ability to create this world, this sort of absurdist and surreal world that is nonsensical, but at the same time very much mirroring some real world systems that exist. Or rather, it's almost like 1984, where you're looking at this world that is this authoritarian, that has ultimate control, can have whatever message it wants. It doesn't really matter what the truth is. And that's really at the core of this sort of messaging of what's going on here. But I think it's, again, the tone that worked really well for me. I love the absurdist side. The reason it's not a best of list, I think it is a contender, but again, being on the top of this list. Hey, peekaboo, I see you. Being at the top of this list is because of the fact that I did really enjoy it. I think for me, part of it was I think he died before it finished, so there wasn't really much of a conclusion, where they even have extra chapters that were ultimately not included in the final version. And the ending itself is just very open-ended, because there's not supposed to be a conclusive ending to the story, which is to say, it's a never-ending trial with no basis, no explanation, and never-ending bureaucracy. And that's what we're getting here with the story. And at some point, I found my interest in the dynamic of this world begin to sort of teeter out. And while I don't think it really overstayed its welcome too long, I can't say that it was a fully satisfying book just because of what it was trying to do and the necessary direction that you have to go with that premise. Still, a very thought-provoking book. Okay, next up is Michael Isikoff's Find Me the Votes. And this This would have easily been my best nonfiction of the year. But with everything that's going on, with Trump's reelection, and now Fani Willis being removed from the case, and who knows, by the time you watch this, maybe the appeals court or another appeal of the appeals court might overturn what's going on. But I don't have much hope of this case surviving, or at least her place in this case surviving, let alone the case itself, if she goes surviving, just because of the people who are in charge of replacing her in Georgia are very much not going to do the right thing, and making sure that justice prevails. I mean, that's just not the world we live in. It's not the country we live in. But as a work of nonfiction, I felt like this was a really effectively told narrative of the case around Donald Trump and what he tried to do in Georgia, stealing the election, finding 11,000 whatever votes, and also I think giving a backstory, sort of an insight into Fani Willis and where she comes from, her perspective. And it was just a really well-crafted narrative overall that I found really compelling. I don't think it's a inherently useless book now that we're in this position where the case might just be entirely over. I think there's important context to her, where she comes from and her place here, that I think is really compelling, especially to Georgia voters. But it's not enough for me to put it on my main best of list. I'm not sure it has the weight it did before, because of just where we're at in America, unfortunately, and just the fact that Donald Trump's going to get away with everything that he did, and that's just the country we live in, and we've always lived in this kind of country. So it's not new. It's just, the hope that something might change was naive, and that's the truth of it, at least for now. And next up, we have Gretchen Felker Martin's Cuckoo, which was, I think, her second novel. She was a queer trans author who writes horror that has to do with family trauma, trauma around being trans, and just the horrors of that experience overall. And her first book, I think, received a lot of interest, some criticism because of some of the more, what's the word? Not obscure. It's some might call it obscene, or just graphic depictions in that book, including of real life figures. I was very interested. I love body horror, and that's still very much present here. I guess I should start explaining what the book's actually about. It's basically a conversion camp narrative, except I don't think it's quite as traditional. How do I describe this? I don't want to spoil the book, but to understand the type of horror that it is, you might call it supernatural, you might call it science fiction. It is a monster horror. I really like this story, one, because Gretchen Felker Martin is really good at embodying these real heavy themes around the trans experience and the queer experience and just religious trauma, honestly, in this story in a way that is just really compelling. And even the characters, even though some almost they start off looking a bit caricaturish, they start to show themselves as being more well-rounded, which I think is always good. A good book can do that. And overall, I found this narrative really compelling, and the horror very well executed. For me, I think my problem was that there was a point, maybe 2/3 in the book, where we pivot to part 2, which completely shifts the type of narrative we're telling. And while I think it makes for a compelling conclusion, I don't think it fit in the larger narrative. I think there needed to be some reworking if you want to make it one novel and make it flow better, or maybe even have it 2 novels, or maybe have an independent novella of this one that could have worked. That would have, in my opinion, elevated it from being a really great horror that is honestly on the precipice of being my favorites of the year to making that list. I will say this year I've had, I think, a better year than last year, where I struggled to read as much as I normally do, but also just find books that I really feel excited about. And I think last year this would have been on my best of list. This year it's just a bit more competitive, so it just didn't work out. But still, I'm excited to read more by her, and I can absolutely recommend this book. I think it's a great horror, both in terms of just the feelings you want from horror, at least that I want from horror, and also just the themes that it's dealing with, or rather using horror as a way of exploring real themes. Next up, we have another horror, this time more urban fantasy, kind of like this one is by Peter Klein's 14, the first in the Threshold series. This is another Lovecraftian horror. And I think it leans less on graphic horror, just to say the things that I sort of associate with visceral unnervingness of horror, and more on the urban fantasy side. But what I liked about this was that it was just a really fun and compelling read. After reading more about it, I know it's trying to be sort of like Lost meets, I don't know, Lovecraft maybe. And in that sense, there's a lot of twists and turns. And I think a little too much to be like a really, believable world. It's trying a little too hard to be fun. Almost, I guess it's kind of like a Riley Sayers version of, but in horror. urban fantasy maybe, but I think it's a bit more effective than Wiley Sager. But I digress. It is a fun and compelling novel that I think what it does do right when it comes to horror is create the Lovecraft side. Like, I found the Lovecraft world mostly like believable. Like, if what I'm trying to say was believable in this sort of context. I don't know. I just found myself immersed. I was very immersed in the story. I thought it was fun. I thought it was compelling. I think maybe it could have been a bit more conservative in what it was trying to do. It didn't have to do everything. And I think in that sense, it may have been a more coherent narrative that had, or a more satisfying narrative. As it stands, it is a solid book, a lot of fun. If you love Lovecraft and urban fantasy, check it out. If you love Lost and Lovecraft, I think this is a great book for you. It's guaranteed to be fun. I say guaranteed. Obviously, I can't guarantee anything, but I thought it was fun. And I think you might too. Next up, we have Charles S. Cockles, The Equations of Life. And this one, surprise, well, I put it more in the highlight, I guess, because it's not best of, but it also isn't quite a surprise. If anything, it leans more towards disappointments. I almost considered putting it there, but I didn't want to because that gives it a negative connotation. I didn't want to present this book as if it's something that shouldn't be read, because I think it is good for what it's trying to be, which is to say, a book explaining, I guess, the underlying foundations of life, what controls it, the chemistry of life, and in that sense, the way in which we can use that to understand the building blocks of life and astrobiology at large. It's like an introduction to astrobiology. And I came into this sort of expecting it to be a layman's book, or rather a pop fiction version of his textbook, which is on astrobiology. And I don't think it isn't that. I think what didn't make it excel as much as I had hoped was that it didn't quite cover the topics that I had hoped it would. As someone who is an expert in astrobiology, I would have designed the book differently. I would have targeted different points, different talking points. And I don't think it's necessarily bad. I think I honestly would trust his judgment over mine in terms of what is effective at communicating to the general public, honestly. I really hoped, it'd just be like covering all the stuff in the textbook, this in a way that is more accessible. And that probably doesn't make for a good book. It would literally be textbook if it was. Instead, he focuses on some key components, key aspects of astrobiology and some of the science there, crafting it into a more, I don't want to say narrative nonfiction, but he does try to ground it in more real world things in a way that I think is meant to appeal to more general readers, which I think there's an audience for that. And I think maybe most people are lucky to like it for that. It's just not quite what I wanted. But still, it is a highlight in the sense that I was really looking forward to it, and I'm glad that I finally read it. And it's right now, I think it's probably the best book I can recommend for anyone who's interested in understanding astrobiology, which is to say, what is astrobiology? It's a big question. I would define it as the search to understand the origin and presence of life in the cosmos. So we have the origin of life on Earth and the presence of life outside of Earth. And that is a major concept, or that is the main idea of astrobiology, which is itself a interdisciplinary subject. And I think this is a good introduction. And if you're interested in that topic, and I'm hoping more people will be, that's what the goal of putting it here. I want to highlight it because I want more people to be interested in astrobiology and the investigation, the understanding what we know and how we can know it, and how we can know anything about life when all we have is a sample size of one when it comes to life, and life being just what we have on Earth. Next up, we have Chuck Tingle's Camp Damascus. And this one I enjoyed, probably not quite as high as Cuckoo, partly just because I don't think he's quite as effective at creating the horror that is as viscerally resonating with me, both thematically, but also just in terms of just general horror. It doesn't quite vibe with me quite as much, but generally it's a very compelling and well-written horror book that has to do with, again, a queer camp, conversion camp dynamic, like with Cuckoo. And another reason why it's lower on this list, or I say later on this list, is because I enjoyed it thoroughly. I think it has some interesting themes to discuss. It still was kind of forgettable. Like, I had to look up what the book was. I had to remind myself, how is this different from Cuckoo? Because I wanted to make sure I wasn't integrating them. And really, my memory was extremely, literally just Cuckoo. That's all I remember was the plot of Cuckoo and not this one. And I think I read them around the same time. So it tells you which one was more effective to me. This one leans more heavily, I think, in the religious trauma side, in terms of looking at religious hypocrisy, demonology, which I do love. All in all, it resonated with me because of my queerness and my own religious trauma. Like, I can connect in that sense. And so it's still worth highlighting. That's why it's here again. This is not a critique list. This is not a worst of. This is a best of, or their highlights and surprises. And that's why we're here talking about it now. Next up, we have Chain Gang All Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. And this one honestly probably could have been higher up if we were really doing a best to worst on this list, because I don't think it's quite that dynamic. Because I did love this. This one could have been and almost was. And I honestly, when I read it, I thought it would be in my best of list. I think it really just speaks to how great I think my year has been in terms of finding books that I really love. Because I did really love this. But it wasn't perfect. What were the imperfections? Honestly, I've mostly forgotten. Like I remember what I loved about the book. The writing is compelling. The world is thematically significant. Like this sort of near future dystopian that has prisons that have gladiator type battles, that highlights the corporate nature of prisons, the way in which we dehumanize prisoners, and just that the whole dynamics and issues around that, all the real world present day themes being explored in a speculative way that is just really effective. And honestly, the more I talk about it, the more I think, so I really want to not have it on my best of list, but we're here now. I'm not backing out that I'm this far in this list. This is a great book, and I think it represents what speculative fiction it can be at its best. That is to say, a compelling speculative narrative that has something serious to say or important to say using that speculative premise. Next up, we have my last nonfiction on this list. That is to say, Mayo Clinic on Healthy Aging by a range of authors, doctors really, Nathan K. Labrasa and Christina Kim, MD. These are just the ones that are listed on Goodreads. And this is one that was one of my earliest reads of the year. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to put this on here, but I wanted to make sure I had a good amount of nonfiction. And most of the nonfiction that I really enjoyed, I'm putting on my best of list. But this one, I can't quite put there because while I think it is a interesting and frankly, really useful resource to have, it just doesn't make for great nonfiction reading. It's not intended to be a general nonfiction book. It is almost encyclopedic in the way it is structured. While it has a comprehensive range of sections that talk about everything to do with aging and what impacts it, it doesn't necessarily try to craft a narrative. It is oftentimes extremely repetitive. Don't smoke. Don't overeat, have a balanced diet, exercise, get plenty of sleep, things that are most obvious. And I think there were deeper insights to be had beyond that. But in terms of a general nonfiction, this just isn't something that will be accessible to a lot of people. But as a resource, something to refer to often, I actually can really easily recommend this. I also was a little iffy because it chose to recommend spiritual sides, like the spiritual or alternative medicines, and in certain aspects, at least addressed it. And I felt like I was just uncomfortable with that. It's just a personal feeling of wondering whether or not this is the place to really give what I think is a level of validation to something that is fundamentally just not science, and therefore not really in the purview of Mayo Clinic. But ultimately, it's still here. I'm still talking about it because I think it is much more good than bad. And also because I'm not a doctor, and ultimately I'm not an expert in the subject, and I do trust the experts. And I think this is generally just a really good resource to find good information, good science on the things that impact our aging. I watched this. You did. I think we're good to keep going. My last one is going to be Ocean Vuong's Time as a Mother. And I did love this. I love Ocean Vuong. I really think he is just an amazing writer, really beautiful, poetic. I mean, this one is poetry. It's part of the reason it's on my best of list. Also because I read his other book, and go ahead and spoil it for you. It is on my best of list. But I still wanted to highlight this one because it is beautiful. And I think when it comes to all the books that really stood out to me, this is one that deserves being talked about. Just because I don't always love poetry. And that's still kind of the case here. I didn't always follow what was trying to be said. But in general, I've had an enjoyable time trying to parse the messages he was trying to say. And I think I understood parts of it. And also I really still think the writing is beautiful. Even if I don't always quite follow what it is he's trying to say, I think overall I enjoyed the journey, and I'm glad that I read it. And I can definitely recommend this book and him as an author. Beautiful, and it's just got to do with things like relating to parenthood, like others to say, relationship to one's mother, queerness, growing up queer, and also as an Asian immigrant. That's here and also in his other book, but I'll save that discussion for when I get to my best of list. For now, those are my biggest surprises and highlights of 2024. I hope you've enjoyed watching this. I've enjoyed talking about it, and I hope you all have a great day and a wonderful Christmas and a happy holiday, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.